We have just seen that Josephine expected to rejoin her husband in Egypt, and this gave her reason to suppose that her stay at the baths of Plombières would not last long. But her accident made her conclude that it would be prolonged indefinitely, and she wished, while her health was being reestablished, to have her daughter with her. Hortense was then 15 and was being educated at Madame Capin's boarding school. She sent a mulatto woman after her, whom she was very fond of. Euphemie, as she was called, was the foster sister of Madame Bonaparte, and was even supposed, though I do not know whether the supposition was well founded, to be her natural sister. Euphemie set off with Monsieur Charvet in one of Madame Bonaparte's carriages. On their arrival, Hortense was enchanted with the journey she was about to make, and especially with the idea of going to her mother, for whom she had the liveliest affection. Mademoiselle Hortense was, I will not say a glutton, but excessively fond of good eating. And so Monsieur Charvet, in relating these details, told me that in every town of the least importance, the carriage was replenished with bonbons and dainties, of which Mademoiselle Hortense consumed a great many. One day, when Euphemie and Monsieur Charvet were sound asleep, they were suddenly awakened by a report which to them seemed terrible, and which gave them the greatest uneasiness, since on awakening they found they were passing through a dense forest. This fortuitous accident made Hortense shout with laughter, for they had hardly shown their fright before they were inundated with an odorous foam, which explained where the report came from. It was that of a bottle of champagne placed in one of the pockets of the carriage, in which the heat and the motion, or more probably the roguishness of the young traveler, had uncorked with a good deal of noise. When Mademoiselle Hortense reached Plombières, her mother was nearly well, so that Madame Capin's pupil found there all the distractions and amusement suitable to her age. One has reason to say that every mischance has its good side, but for the accident that happened to Madame Bonaparte, it is among the possibilities that she would have been taken prisoner by the English. She learned, in fact, that the ship Pomona, on which, as we have seen, she wished to make the voyage, had fallen into the hands of the enemies of France. And as, moreover, every letter from General Bonaparte dissuaded his wife from joining him, she returned to Paris. On her arrival, Josephine bethought her of accomplishing a wish that had been expressed by General Bonaparte before his departure. He had told her that he would like to have a country house on his return, and had even commissioned his brother Joseph to take the matter in hand, which Monsieur Joseph did not do. Madame Bonaparte, who was, on the contrary, always on the lookout for whatever might please her husband, set several people to work hunting up something that might be suitable in the environs of Paris. After hesitating long between Rie and Malmaison, she decided on the latter and bought it from Monsieur Le Couteau du Molay for, I think, the sum of 400,000 francs. It was stories of this kind that Monsieur Charvet was kind enough to tell me in the days when I first entered the service of Madame Bonaparte. Everyone in the house liked to talk about her, and assuredly not for the sake of slandering her, for no woman was ever more loved by those around her, or deserved to be so. General Bonaparte also was an excellent man in the privacy of family life. Since the return of the first consul from his Egyptian campaign, several attempts had been made on his life. The police had many times warned him to be on his guard and not to venture about alone in the neighborhood of Malmaison. The first consul was not much inclined to be suspicious, especially before this period, but the discovery of the snares laid for him in his most intimate private life forced him to use prudence and precaution. It has been said since that these pretended conspiracies were mere fabrications of the police for the purpose of making themselves necessary to the first consul, or else, who knows, of the first consul himself, in order to redouble the interest attaching to his person by fear of the perils menacing his life. And the absurdity of these attempts has been alleged in proof of their falsity. I do not pretend to solve such mysteries, but it seems to me that in the matter in question, absurdity proves nothing, or at all events, does not prove falsity. The conspirators of that epoch have given us their own measures so far as extravagance is concerned. What could be more absurd and yet more real than the atrocious folly of the infernal machine? However it may be, I am going to recount what happened under my own eyes during the first months of my sojourn at Malmaison. Nobody in the house had the least doubt of the reality of these attempts, or at any rate, nobody displayed any such doubts before me. All means to get rid of the first consul seemed good to his enemies. They took everything into their calculations, even his recreations, as the following occurrence will prove. There were repairs and embellishments to make in the chimneys of the first consul's apartments at Malmaison. The contractor who had undertaken them had sent some marble cutters, among whom had slipped in, according to all appearances, some wretches bribed by the conspirators. The persons attached to the first consul were constantly on the watch and used the greatest vigilance. They thought they noticed that there were some men among those laborers who pretended to be working, but whose manner and appearance were not in keeping with their occupation. These suspicions were unhappily but too well founded, for when the apartments were ready to receive the first consul, and at the moment when he came to occupy them, someone found, in making a turn about the rooms on the desk in which he was about to seat himself, a snuff box exactly similar to the one the first consul was in the habit of using. It was supposed at first that this box really belonged to him, and had been forgotten there by his valet, but the doubts excited by the appearance of some of the marble cutters having taken more consistency, the snuff was examined and analyzed. It was poisoned. Those who plotted this treachery had, so people said in those days, an understanding with other conspirators who were to try a different means of getting rid of the first consul. They determined to assail the guard of the chateau of Malmaison and forcibly abduct the head of the government. With this end in view, they had uniforms made similar to those of the consular guides, who were then on duty day and night near the first consul, and who followed him on horseback in his excursions. In this costume, and by aid of their understanding with their accomplices within the house, the pretended marble cutters, they might easily have approached and mingled with the guard, who were fed and lodged at the chateau. They might even have reached the first consul and carried him off. This first scheme, however, was abandoned as too risky, and the conspirators flattered themselves that they could attain their object more surely and with less danger by taking advantage of the first consul's frequent journeys to Paris. Aided by their disguise, they were to mingle with the guides of the escort and kill them. Their rallying point was to be the quarries of Nanterre. Their plot was discovered for the second time. There was a rather deep quarry in the park at Malmaison, and as it was feared that it might be taken advantage of as a hiding place whence violence might be done to the first consul in one of his solitary walks, an iron door was put there. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon of February 19th, the first consul repaired in the state to the Tuileries, which was then styled the Palace of the Government, in order to install himself there with all his household. His two colleagues were with him, one of whom, the third consul, was to occupy the same residence and establish himself in the Pavilion of Flora. The carriage of the consuls was drawn by 6 white horses, presented to the conqueror of Italy by the Emperor of Germany. Under the signatures had been affixed to the Treaty of Campo Formio. The magnificent saber worn by the first consul at this ceremony had also been given to him by that monarch on the same occasion. A remarkable thing about this formal change of domicile was that the acclamations and regards of the crowd, and even of the most distinguished spectators who thronged the windows of the Rue Thionville and the Quai Voltaire, were addressed only by the first consul and the young warriors of his brilliant staff, still all bronzed by the sun of the pyramids or of Italy. In the first rank marched Generals Lannes and Murat, the first easy to recognize by the audacity of his appearance and his thoroughly military manners, the second by the same qualities, and in addition by a very punctilious elegance in his costume and his weapons. His new title of brother-in-law, too, the first consul likewise, contributed powerfully to fix universal attention on him. For my part, all mine was absorbed by the principal person in the procession, whom, like all the people who surrounded me, I never looked at without a sort of religious admiration, and by his stepson, the son of my excellent mistress, and himself my former master, the brave, modest, and good Prince Eugene, who at that time was not yet a prince. On arriving at the Tuileries, the first consul took possession at once of the apartment he always occupied thereafter, and which formed part of what had been the royal apartments. This suite was composed of a bedroom, bathroom, and cabinet, and a salon in which he gave audience in the morning. A second salon where the aides de camp on duty remained, and which served him as a dining room. And of the vast antechamber, Madame Bonaparte had her own apartments on the ground floor, the same she occupied when empress. Over the part of the building inhabited by the first consul was the lodging of Monsieur de Bourrienne, his secretary, communication between them being established by means of a private stairway. Although he already had courtiers at this period, he had as yet no court. The etiquette was of the simplest description. As I have said before, the first consul slept in the same bed as his wife. They inhabited together sometimes at Tuileries and sometimes Malmaison. As yet neither grand marshal, chamberlains, prefect of the palace, nor ladies of honor, tiring women and pages were to be seen. The household of the first consul comprised merely Monsieur Pfister, the steward, Monsieur Venard, chief cook, Messieurs Gaillot and Dauguet, superintendents, and Colin, chief of the kitchen and its dependencies. Monsieur Ripaud was librarian, and the elder Monsieur Vignonia, equerry. The persons engaged in private service were the first valet de chambre, Monsieur Ambar, Hébert, ordinary valet, and Rustem, the first consul's Mameluke. There were besides some 15 persons employed in subordinate offices. Monsieur de Bourrienne governed the entire force and checked the expenditures. Although very quick-tempered, he had been able to conciliate universal respect and affection. He was kind, obliging, and above all, very just. Hence, at the time of his disgrace, the whole household was grieved about it. For my part, I have retained a sincere and respectful memory of him, and I hope that if he has had the misfortune to find enemies among the great, he has at least met among his inferiors none but grateful hearts, which have keenly regretted him. Some days after this installation, there was a reception of the diplomatic corps at the chateau. The details I am about to give concerning it will show how simple was the etiquette at the time of what was already styled the court. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the apartments of Madame Bonaparte, situated, as I have said, in the part of the ground floor overlooking the garden, were thronged with people. There was an incredible profusion of feathers, diamonds, and dazzling toilettes. Such a crowd was present that it was necessary to open the door of Madame Bonaparte's bedroom, for the two salons were so full that it was impossible to move around in them. When all these people had taken their places as well as they could, after a good deal of embarrassment and trouble, Madame Bonaparte was announced and entered, conducted by Monsieur de Talleyrand. She wore a white muslin robe with short sleeves and a pearl necklace. Her head was bare, and her braided hair kept in place by a shell comb with a most charming negligence. Her ears must have been agreeably struck by the flattering murmurs that greeted her entrance. Never, I think, had she more grace and majesty. Monsieur de Talleyrand, still giving his hand to Madame Bonaparte, had the honor of presenting her in succession to the members of the diplomatic corps, not by their own names, but by those of their courts. Afterwards, he made the round of the two salons with her. The review of the second salon was half over when, without having himself announced, the first consul entered in an extremely simple uniform with a tricolored scarf of silk with fringe of the same material tied round him. He wore white cashmere tights with top boots and carried his hat in his hand. This unelaborate costume, appearing in the midst of the embroidered coats overloaded with ribbons and jewels which were worn by the ambassadors, formed a contrast at least as imposing as did the toilette of Madame Bonaparte with those of the ladies invited. before relating how it was that I left Madame Bonaparte's service for that of the head of the state and the abode of Malmaison for the second campaign in Italy, I think it is well to stop, give a glance behind me, and set down here one or two souvenirs of the time when I still belonged to Madame Bonaparte. In the evenings when nearly everybody had retired, she was fond of sitting up to play a game of billiards, and oftener still of backgammon. It happened once that, having dismissed all her company and being still disinclined to sleep, she asked me if I knew how to play billiards. On my reply, which was affirmative, she asked me with charming kindness to have a game with her, and I had the honor of playing several. Although I have a certain skill, I managed so as to let her win frequently, which amused her very much. If this was flattery, I must own myself guilty of it, but I think I would have acted in the same way with any other woman, whatever her rank and position in relation to me, even though she was not half so amiable as Madame Bonaparte. The porter of Malmaison, who had the entire confidence of his masters, among other means of defense and surveillance, which he had devised in order to guard the house and person of the first consul from an unexpected attack, had obtained a number of enormous watchdogs, two of which were very fine Newfoundlands. The embellishments of Malmaison were constantly in progress, and a crowd of workmen spent the nights there, all of whom had been warned not to go out of doors alone. One night, when several of these watchdogs were inside the house with the workmen and allowing themselves to be caressed, their apparent gentleness inspired one of these men with so much courage, or rather imprudence, that he was not afraid to go out alone. He even thought that to avoid all danger he could not do better than to put himself under the protection of one of these terrible animals. So he took one with him, and they went together very amicably through the doorway, but hardly was he outside, and the dog sprang upon his unlucky companion and threw him down. The cries of the poor workmen awakened several of the men servants, and they ran to his rescue. It was time, for the dog was keeping him down and choking him cruelly. He was picked up badly wounded. Madame Bonaparte, on learning this incident, had the man who so narrowly escaped being a victim cared for until he was perfectly cured, and gave him a large gratuity, at the same time recommending him to be more prudent in future. Every moment that the first consul could snatch from affairs he spent at Malmaison, the eve of each décade, the 10th day of the week, was a festival looked forth to by everyone in the chateau. Madame Bonaparte used to send domestics afoot and on horseback to meet her husband, and even went herself frequently with her daughter and the intimates of Malmaison. When I was not on duty, I took the same direction myself, and all alone, for we all had an equal affection for the first consul and experienced the same anxiety about him. Such was the bitterness and the audacity of the enemies of the first consul that the road, though not very long, between Paris and Malmaison was strewn with snares and dangers. We knew that several attempts to abduct him while passing over it had been made and might be repeated. The passage most suspected was that of the quarries of Nanterre, which I have mentioned already. Hence, they were carefully visited and inspected by the men of the household on the days of the first consul's visit. In the end, they filled up the holes that were nearest the road. The first consul was pleased with our devotion and let us see his satisfaction, but for his own part seemed always fearless and without anxiety. In fact, he often mocked at us for hours, and would tell the good Josephine very seriously that he had had a fine escape on the road, that men with sinister faces had shown themselves many a time while he was passing, that one of them had had the audacity to take aim at him, etc. And when he saw her very frightened, he would burst out laughing and give her several taps or kisses on the cheek or neck and say, "Don't be afraid, you great ninny." They would not dare. He busied himself on these holidays, as he himself called them, more with his private affairs than with those of the state, but he could never remain idle. He was always demolishing, restoring, building, enlarging, planting, pruning in the chateau and in the park, examining the expense accounts, calculating his income, and prescribing economies. Time passed quickly in all these occupations, and the moment soon came when he must go, as he used to say, to resume The yoke of misery. Toward the end of March 1800, 5 or 6 months after my entering the service of Madame Bonaparte, the first consul kept his eyes on me one day while eating his dinner, and having weighed and measured me up from top to toe, "Young man," said he to me, "would you like to follow me to the campaign?" I replied with much emotion that I would ask nothing better. "Very well, then, you shall follow me." And on rising from the table, he ordered Mr. Pfister, the steward, to put me on the list of those belonging to the household who were to take the journey. My preparations did not take long. I was enchanted at the notion of being attached to the personal service of so great a man, and I already beheld myself on the other side of the Alps. The first consul went away without me. Mr. Pfister, through a possibly premeditated forgetfulness, had omitted to inscribe me on the list. I was in despair. I went crying to my excellent mistress to relate my misadventure, and she kindly endeavored to console me by saying, "Oh, well, Constant, all is not lost, my friend. You will stay with me and go hunting in the park to divert yourself, and perhaps in the end the first consul will ask you again." Nevertheless, Madame Bonaparte did not expect this, for she thought, as I did, though out of kindness she would not tell me so, that the first consul, having changed his mind and no longer desiring my services in the campaign, had himself countermanded his order. I soon obtained direct proof on the contrary. On the day to Dijon, in his march towards Mont Saint Bernard, the first consul, who thought I was in his suite, asked for me, and learned then that I had been forgotten. He showed some dissatisfaction and desired Monsieur de Bourrienne to write immediately to Madame Bonaparte and beg her to send me along without delay. One morning, when my vexation had returned more keen than ever, Madame Bonaparte summoned me and said, with Monsieur de Bourrienne's letter in her hand, "Constant, since you are resolved to quit us to make your campaigns, you may rejoice and be glad, for you are going to start. The first consul has sent for you. Call on Monsieur Marais and inquire whether he is not to send a courier very soon. You can travel along with him." At this good news, I was in a state of inexpressible rapture, which I did not try to hide. "Then you are very glad to get away from us," observed Madame Bonaparte, with a kindly smile. "No, madame," I replied, "but to come nearer the first consul is to not go further from madame." "I hope so truly," she returned. "Go, Constant, and take good care of him." If there had been any need of it, this recommendation from my noble mistress would have augmented the zeal and vigilance with which I had determined to fill my new position. I ran without delay to the house of Monsieur Marais, the Secretary of State, who knew me and had shown me much kindness. "Get ready at once," he said to me. "A courier will be starting this evening or tomorrow." I returned in haste to Malmaison to announce my near departure to Madame Bonaparte. She instantly had a good post-chaise prepared for me and Diabau, that was the name of the courier I was to accompany me, was charged to provide horses for me all along the road. Monsieur Marais gave me 800 francs for my traveling expenses. This sum, which I was far from expecting, made me open my eyes. Never had I beheld myself so rich. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a messenger came from Thibaut to notify me that everything was ready. I went to his house, where the post-chaise was waiting, and we set off. I traveled very agreeably, sometimes in the post-chaise and sometimes as courier. In the latter case, I took Thibaut's place and he mine. I expected to rejoin the first consul at Martigny, but his march had been so rapid that I only came up with him at the convent of Mont Saint Bernard. On our way, we were continually passing regiments on the march and officers and soldiers who were hastening to rejoin several corps. Their enthusiasm was inexpressible. Those who had made the Italian campaigns rejoiced at returning to so beautiful a country. Those who did not know it yet were burning to see the battlefield immortalized by French valor and the genius of the hero still marching at their head. They all acted as if going to a feast, and climbed the Valais Mountains, singing. It was 8 o'clock in the morning when I arrived at headquarters. Pfister announced me, and I found the commander-in-chief in the great lower hall of the hospice. He was taking his breakfast standing, along with his staff. As soon as he caught sight of me, "Ah, there you are. Then, you rogue, why didn't you come with me?" said he. I excused myself, saying that to my great regret I had received a countermand, or at least had been left behind at the moment of departure. "Lose no time, my friend," he added. "Eat a mouthful quickly. We are going to start." From that moment, I was attached to the special service of the first consul in the capacity of ordinary valet de chambre, that is, in my turn. This service gave me very little to do. Monsieur Ambard, chief valet de chambre of the first consul, was in the habit of dressing him from head to foot. Directly after breakfast, we began to descend the mountain. Several persons slid down on the snow, very much as people rolled down from the top of the Russian mountains into the Beaujon garden. I followed their example. They called it making a sledge. The commander-in-chief also slid down an almost perpendicular glacier in this way. His guide was an alert and courageous peasant whose future the first consul assured for the rest of his life. Some young soldiers who had gone astray in the snow had been discovered almost dead with cold. But the dogs of the religious inn, transported to the hospice where they had received all imaginable care, had been speedily returned to life. The first consul manifested his gratitude to the good fathers for such act of a generous charity. Before quitting the hospice, where tables loaded with provisions were prepared for the soldiers as they climbed up, he left the pious monks. In recompense for the hospitality, he and his companions had received a considerable sum of money and the vouchers for an annuity for the support of their convent. That same day we scaled Mont Albaredo, but as this passage would have been impracticable for the cavalry and artillery, they were sent by way of the town of Bard under the batteries of the fort. The first consul had ordered them to pass it by night and on the gallop, and had had the wheels of the artillery wagons and the horses' feet wrapped in straw. These precautions were not sufficient completely to prevent the Austrians from hearing our troops, and the cannons of the fort never stopped firing grape shot. But luckily, the houses of the town sheltered our soldiers from the fire of their enemies, and more than half the army traversed the city without having much to suffer. As to the household of the first consul, commanded by General Gordin, of which I was one, it went around the fort of Bard. May 23rd, we forded a torrent which flowed between the town and the fort, with the first consul at our head. He climbed afterwards, followed by General Berthier and several officers, a footpath up the Albaredo which commanded the fort and city of Bard, there turning his pocket glass on the opposing batteries, against whose fire nothing protected him but some bushes. He found fault with the disposal of the troops made by the officer charged with commanding the siege, and ordered new ones, whose effect would be, as he said himself, to make the place fall into his hands within a very short time, and rid him henceforward of the trouble given him by this fort, which, said he, had hindered him from sleeping the 2 days he had spent at the convent of St. Maurice. Then, extending himself at the foot of a fir tree, he fell into a sound slumber, the army meanwhile continuing its passage, refreshed by this brief instant of repose. The first consul went down the mountain again, continued his march, and went to bed at Urvray, where he was to pass the night. The brave General Lannes, who commanded the vanguard, acted after a fashion as our quartermaster, seizing by main force every place that barred the road. It was only a few hours after he had forced his way into Urvray that we entered it. Such was this miraculous passage of Mont Saint Bernard. Horses, cannons, artillery wagons, immense stores, all were dragged or carried over glaciers, which seemed inaccessible, and by roads apparently impracticable, even for a single man. The Austrian cannons succeeded no better than the snow and ice in arresting the French army. So true it is that the genius and perseverance of the first consul had communicated themselves, so to say, even to the least of the soldiers, and inspired them with a courage and force, the results of which will one day seem fabulous. June 2. which was the morrow of the passage of the Tessen. And the very day of our entrance into Milan, the first consul learned that the fort of Bard had been taken the day previous. Hence, his arrangement of troops had promptly produced its effect, and the route of communication by way of the St. Bernard was cleared. The first consul entered Milan without having encountered much resistance. The whole population had thronged about his passage, and he was received with 1,000 acclamations. The confidence of the Milanese was redoubled when they learned that he had promised the assembled clergy to maintain the Catholic worship and clergy as they were established, and had made them take an oath of fealty to the Cisalpine Republic.